Hello everybody, welcome back. Dr. Stringer here, and we are on to Module 6. We're going to be talking about surveillance today. So just a little bit of a theoretical foundation on environmental criminology. For those of you that have not seen all of this in the past, environmental criminology really looks at, not so much looking at the individual and looks at patterns across place. So it's kind of a macro level criminology, if you will. It doesn't look at social learning theory and so much as why people commit the crimes, but so much more along the lines of, assuming kind of a rationality that they're creating them because of the opportunity, and so these theories tend to be your routine activities theory, your crime pattern theory, situational crime prevention, defensible space, your broken windows theories, and as we already know, crime is not evenly distributed across society. There are some places that have more crime, some people that have less crime, and so they are different. So some broad themes from environmental criminology. So an environment is less likely to have crime when the owners and residents take ownership over the space and are willing to intervene if something goes wrong. This might be considered by some of you like informal social control. Rather than calling the police, residents and owners are intervening and taking care of things. Residents and owners can naturally observe behaviors that occur on or near their property. If this is the case, these places might have less crime. It also has the appearance of being cared for, not isolated. This gets into your broken windows ideas of things not being cared for, as well as mixed land use areas. If it's not one of those, it's less likely to have crime. And so just to look at some intermediate goals of CPTED. This is crime prevention through environmental design. So CPTED is the acronym for that. So some of the goals are access control. So some of you might have actually done some of these things yourself, such as having locks on your doors or alarms in your house, fences. All of these things prevent people from getting into an area and limit access to those people that you want to be in an area. There are also other measures such as surveillance that enhance the ability of legitimate users to observe the presence of others and their actions, such as CCTV, lighting, windows, things like that. And then you actually have your activity support and motivation reinforcement. These are your kind of community building atmosphere type of things, neighborhood watch, social events, things that kind of build this cohesion within the community. So neighborhood watch hasn't been very successful, but some other events that kind of go along with kind of social disorganization and kind of trying to make socially organized communities. But anyway, so CPTED techniques with empirical support. There have been some things such as street lighting, CCTV, alarms, things like that are probably the most popular things with empirical support. But you also have your street barriers or street layout redesigns and property markers, things like that, that tend to have some support as well. CPTED has been successfully applied in many contexts. So residences, bars, taverns, retail establishments, public transit, these things tend to work as well, as these are places that have actually successfully used the policies and procedures of CPTED to be successful. But it is important to remember that there is no cookie cutter policy. What you would do in a bar or tavern to prevent crime might be completely different than what you would do in a retail establishment. If you are, trying to prevent shoplifters, having a burglar alarm is probably not going to help very much. So you want to think about what types of policies are effective and whether it applies to a certain type of application. So, getting into CCTV and crime prevention, we had this Welsh and Ferreting article that we used to assign when we taught this class, but now We're just kind of summarizing it, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. And it's a meta-analysis of a public area CCTV and crime prevention program. And so there's 40 evaluations. It's 40 studies that they put together to look at this one research question about whether CCTV was effective. So the arguments for crime prevention: CCTV, especially when well publicized, may deter potential offenders due to their increased objective probability of detection. So what we're getting at there is, if someone's being recorded but they don't know that they're being recorded, then the CCTV is not likely to deter their behavior. But, as some of you might have seen, if you go into a retail establishment and you see one of these TVs and it says "Smile, you're on TV" or something like that, and then you see your image on the television, then that tells the person, hey, you're being recorded. And so this is known to have some impact on people's behavior when they know that they're being recorded. I know that I'm being recorded right now, so I might be a little bit less deviant than I might be if I was giving a face-to-face class. But being recorded does have an effect, especially if someone's thinking about doing some sort of criminal activity. They would be less likely to do so. So it also may increase the actual probability of detection. If you have TV or CCTVs that are actually being monitored, and there's police or security officers watching them as someone is shoplifting, then they're able to intervene much more easily and become more aware of what people are doing and the crimes that are occurring in real time, and will be able to get there to detect them and possibly even arrest them or take them into custody in a faster manner. So you also might see some increase in pedestrian usage of those places. This would be mainly due to non-criminal people, if they think that an area is safer because of the television or the cameras, then they might be more likely to go there. And so it might encourage increased security of potential victims. And as I said, you may lead to more police or security interventions, and you may increase community pride. People tend to be proud of their reductions in crime. So, can CCTV increase crime? What? Increase crime? We don't want to do that. But this would actually be the absolute worst thing that could happen. But it is possible, and some of these things can get at that. So the arguments for that are that it could give potential victims of assault a false sense of security. You might think that you're safe just because you're being recorded, but if you're on the MARTA, at 3 a.m. And you get mugged, there might be a recording of it, but it's not necessarily going to prevent it from happening. It might, if someone's watching it and sees it happening, they might be able to send the police to you. But if, it's just a recording and no one's actively watching it, it's probably not going to do very much. So these are things to think about too. But another thing is it may encourage increased reporting of crimes. So there's a lot of crimes that occur that we don't know about because they just don't get reported. We try to measure crimes through, self-report surveys and arrests and things like that, but there's tons of crimes that just don't get reported. But if there's cameras monitoring 24/7, and we go back and look at those, we can probably catch a lot more crimes that we didn't know about before. And so that might create just looking at the numbers, you might think that, well, we put cameras in place and now crime's increased. But those of us that are familiar with this phenomenon know that it's not actually that crime's increased, we just become aware of more of the crime that's actually occurring that we didn't know about before. And then there's also this idea of displacement. Displacement is a very important phenomenon to think about. And so what displacement might do is, if you have a crime or a camera that you put in place maybe in the back of a shopping mall, that might deter people from robbing the patrons of the shopping mall at the back of the shopping mall where they know the camera is. but then they're just going to go maybe to another part of the mall, maybe the exit on the side of the mall, or they might even go to another mall. But then that's just displacing that crime, and that could also create an increase in crime at that other area, that other mall, or that other area of that particular mall. So this displacement can actually create increases in crime in other places. So here's just a summary of the CCTV evaluations that they looked at. One thing worth noting here is they did actually have where they looked at whether they were active or passive cameras. Because, as I said, this is important. If it's just something that's recording people, you might be able to go back and look at it later to watch it, and that might help you to apprehend the person later. But if it's an active camera, or actively being monitored by the security or maybe even the police, then that would enable the police to then respond to that area as they're realizing that this is happening right now. You see a lot of these cameras in downtown Atlanta and things like that, for those of you that go down there. And so these are so that the police can see what's going on and then respond appropriately. And they also record too, so they're getting a little bit of both there. So looking at the results by the settings. So city and town centers, we had 22 of those. After combining the countries together, and I forgot to mention that the previous slide, we can go back to that, is mainly looking at places in the United Kingdom. We had some places that were in Sweden, and we had Cincinnati, but most of it is the UK, so that's worth mentioning as well. This was mostly used there because there's a lot more CCTV in the UK. But after combining the countries, CCTV led to a small but insignificant reduction in crime, only about 7%. In public housing, is pretty much about the same. It's insignificant, but only about 7%. It is a reduction, though, so it's in the right direction. Again, public transportation, 23% reduction, which looks a lot better, but yet still insignificant. And this is probably a factor of the, only having 4 cases. So it's difficult to achieve statistical significance with only that many cases. But we won't get into all of that with this class. This is not statistics or research methods. But anyway, so looking at car parks, you had different results, and they didn't really figure out any definitive results from that. 2 different statistical techniques produced different results. So the conclusions of this are, other results indicate that CCTV did not reduce violence overall, but some of the stuff did say that it could impact MVT, which is motor vehicle thefts. So that might be an important thing to look at in the future. We're actually going to do that with the next article, for those of you that have read it. So results that were most promising in the UK, while other countries were included, there appears to be a lot more research in the UK. So that's an important thing to think about. But CCTV works to reduce crime, but it may be different across contexts and specific crime. We did see some reductions there, even though they weren't significant. So we need to look a little bit more into this. It's another one of those things, and it's like, well, it tends to suggest that it could be doing it, but we don't really know for sure. So, how about something that's a little bit more relevant to the United States, since that's where we are, or at least most of us are, I suppose. This is a distance learning class. So the Kaplan article that you all read came from Newark, New Jersey. Just to summarize that, 3 objectives to improve prior research, test the crime deterrent effects of strategic versus non-strategic placements of CCTV, demonstrate a new technique of creating view sheds, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in the next slide, and evaluate the overall effectiveness of CCTV. So what are we going to use to do that? Crime mapping. We've already learned what crime mapping is, so we can just go ahead and look at this. And this is not a crime map, but it is a map of an area. And so what you get here is a camera in the middle, and this is just an example. But then this area in the white circle is the area that camera is supposed to be covered. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but there are a lot of other things in this area. There are trees, there are buildings, I don't know what this stuff is over here, but there's a lot of other things in the building, or in the area there. These things are called view sheds. These things prevent the camera from seeing certain areas. So these can be important because they might displace some crime to areas that are within the view sheds. So what crimes do researchers hypothesize that cameras will deter? Well, they had 3 specific crimes: shootings, auto thefts, and thefts from autos. So you look at thefts from autos, there's almost always a lot more of those than there are auto thefts in modern society, because cars are just very difficult to steal, given all of the new technology. But it's much easier to just steal things out of the cars. So be careful when you leave your iPhone in your car. It might be locked. They might not steal your car, but they might steal your iPhone out of it. Now, one of the most common way that cars are getting stolen nowadays, just a sidetrack, is people that leave their keys in the car. So it's really easy to steal a car that has the keys in it, but it's almost impossible to steal one without the keys, especially with these new laser-coated keys and everything. But anyway, that's a side note. So based on the meta-analysis we looked at before, it seems like it might be appropriate to expect that we have some sort of effect on motor vehicle thefts, and maybe even thefts from autos. But what about shootings? Well, we don't really know, but probably not, right? Shootings tend to be kind of crimes of passion, and if you're not really thinking quite as much about whether there's a camera around if you're going to shoot someone, right? This is more of an anger and an impulsive type of thing usually. So you might not see so much of that. But looking at the results, so there's an experimental and a control area. There's an area that doesn't have cameras, and then there's an experimental area that has the cameras. There's no significant difference for auto-related crimes, but there is a significant difference for the shootings. Well, how did that happen? Well, mathematically there is a difference, but it's not realistic. So the difference doesn't really matter that much, is what they say. So the motor vehicle thefts was significantly lower after the installation of the cameras. So when we had cameras, then motor vehicle thefts went down. So that's a great conclusion, right? So the cameras are not successful in reducing overall crime, as had been promised by the politicians and police and everybody else. But this study illustrates, however, that CCTV can reduce some crime in some contexts. But still, we need to do some cost-benefit analysis as to whether the cost and effort of the CCTVs are worth the crime prevented, as this is a very expensive endeavor, especially if you're going to pay people to watch them in real time. That can get pretty expensive pretty quickly. So, the next thing to think about is body cameras. There's been a lot of this in the news in recent months and years. Are body cameras effective? So cameras are to the benefit of the public and the protection of the police. So for an example, if we look at the Michael Brown shooting, had the officer been wearing a camera, then we would probably have a much better idea of the interaction between the two and how it looked. What happened, exactly what happened. There wouldn't be a whole lot of conflict and so much political strife and social conflict over this. It would be, here's what happened, it's wrong or it's justified, So another thing to think about too is, we've talked about how cameras can influence criminals. We don't usually think about police officers as being criminals. We usually consider the two to be mutually exclusive. However, in a lot of, not in a lot, but in some instances, there are police officers that commit crimes. There have been police officers recently who have been convicted of murder for situations just like this. And a lot of that is related to having the camera. Because it's very difficult to deny when you shoot an unarmed person if it's been videotaped. So police officers are probably likely to change their behavior a little bit too, if they know they're being videotaped. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. So, Research questions. So can cameras be used to effectively control police behavior? Well, can body cameras reduce the amount of illicit police use of force incidents? Are police less likely to use unnecessary force if they know they're being videotaped? So prior research gives us a good reason to believe that police behavior will change if they're continually on camera. Most people, like I said, behave differently. Police officers are people too. So if they know they're being videotaped, they're less likely to do things that might be considered criminal, just like other people. If they know they're being videotaped, don't want to be videotaped committing crimes. So this study took place in Rialto, California, and some shifts were randomly assorted into control and experimental groups. So when you came in, you're a police officer, you show up for your shift, you're going to get assigned to an experimental group or a control group, and that means that if you're in the experimental group, you're going to wear a body camera. If you're in the control group, then you don't have a body camera. So the results. Well, the results are that the shifts that did not have body cameras on them had twice as many use of force incidents as the shifts that didn't have body cameras. And there was also a significant reduction in complaints against officers once the body cameras were introduced. Isn't that interesting? So, here's a little graph that looks at this time series here. And just to look at it, so, let's see if I can maybe get this pointer. There we go. So if we look at over here, we've got the intervention was introduced right around here is where they brought in the body cameras. And we see we have this really high baseline of use of force incidents. Well, as soon as we start using the body cameras, this goes way down. So it looks like there could be some effect there. Now also, here is the complaints of use of force. And so we see right around month 12 there, when the body cameras were introduced, they go way down and they're almost zero the entire time, except for this area right around month 19 and 20. Something must have happened there that was going on. But looking at that, it looks like the cameras are having some possible effect on not only use of force incidents, but complaints about use of force. So, when we think about all of this, what can we conclude about police officers and cameras? Well, it's probably a little bit too soon, just based on this evidence, to make any large, overarching conclusions. But that's okay. It's a relatively new thing. We're going to need some more researchers. But just be wary of those that would go out there and tell you, oh, we know that this is absolutely going to do something, or no, it's not going to do anything, because we don't know that just yet. However, we do have some evidence that suggests that it could, and it could very well be. But we need more research to come up with a blanket conclusion that it does. We don't want to say these things too soon. From what we do know, the research seems to suggest that these cameras will have some impact. It's likely a positive one that will at least protect the public from unnecessary use of force, and possibly even protect police officers from being unjustifiably accused of brutality, because that does happen to some extent as well. And this would help us to be able to figure out the differences between these two situations. So, what are some other considerations? Some other considerations are, what are the cons? Well, police officers might not take the same safety precautions if they know they're on camera. They might change their behavior for the worse, and they might actually be more likely to get harmed. That's a possible consideration to think about. A big one is costs. The cameras themselves usually cost about $300 or $400, but they have some other ones that cost about $12. But the cameras themselves are not really the main source of the costs. What the big issue is the data storage and managing it, and keeping track of all these hundreds of thousands of hours of recordings, being able to sort through it and find, the exact camera footage that you want and things. This is where it's going to get really challenging. I also want to think about issues of confidentiality and privacy. Open records requests. When people are calling the police, they're usually not looking their best and having their best day. You're going to have people that are victims of crime, especially when you have juveniles. Should these people be recorded? Victims in precarious positions, victims of domestic violence. What about police officers who are being killed? There was a clip on the news. I don't remember what city it was in recently, but it released some body camera footage up until just like 2 seconds before a police officer was shot and killed, where it showed a man pull out a gun from underneath his shirt and point it at the police officer, and then it stopped the video. The news, that wasn't released, but we don't know what happened. We know what happened 2 seconds later is that this police officer was shot and killed. And so, are these things that really should be on the news? These things that the public wants to see or needs to see, and you have to think about, the victims' families and things like that. How traumatic that could be to see things like that. So these are things to think about too as we move forward in thinking about this. The last thing I wanted to talk about was drones. We're not seeing a lot of research on this, but it is something to think about. More and more police departments are using them. They're being very widely used in the military because you fly over enemy areas, enemy combatants. You don't have to worry about a plane being shot down with a pilot and I think people in them because drones can be shot down and the pilot is off somewhere else at the base who's just piloting it. But police are actually using these things too for surveillance, for drug growing operations, to track those down, accident scenes, things like that. Interestingly, other members of criminal justice are also using them, specifically the criminals. They've become very popular with getting drugs into prisons because they can fly over the prison wall and drop something from the plane, such as drugs, porn, and whatever else criminals aren't or the prisoners aren't supposed to have, into the yard, and then the prisoners can recover them. They're also being used for drug deliveries and things like that. The big thing with these becoming so popular with criminals too is a very similar reason for the military's idea of not being having a person in the plane. So even if the prison guards or the police find the drone and can apprehend the drone, so to speak, there's still no person there. So they don't have to run the risk of being arrested as much because then the police would have to find who was piloting the drone, which can be another challenge that is posed to the police, and another way that the criminals are using technology to achieve their goals as well. And so police are going to have to figure out ways of combating this, as well as prison guards. So what are the policy implications of all of this? Well, CCTV in the public area. Well, it's not a cure-all for all crime, but it might impact some specific crimes. It's just like everything else that you'll probably learn about throughout all of your classes. There's no one thing that's going to cure all crime. If there was, a lot of us would be out of a job. We do need to think about how much we are willing to spend on cameras, whether they're going to be worth it or not. These are things to think about too. The body-worn police cameras, they certainly seem like a good idea too, but we need to do a lot more research on this. It's such a new thing that it seems like we're going to need to check out what's going on and how they're being used and what are the best policies and practices. So the best way to be able to do research on them is for them to be used. So we're happy to see that that's actually happening in a lot of places and is getting us some very new, interesting footage, especially when it comes to police use of force. So that is all I have for today, and I thank you all for your attention, and I hope you have a good rest of your week, and I will talk to you next week, and have a good one.